What are some of the flavors, varieties of Gnosticism? This is the 12th video in my series on Gnosticism for today. So there's more than a dozen kinds of Gnosticism. Some are earlier, like the ones named after the founders, Basilides, and a little bit earlier, Simonians. In those early forms, you can already see the elaborate heavenly layers of being, heavenly powers. You start to see the emphasis on two different kinds of gods, higher and lower, things like that. And of course, the emphasis on gnosis, which is characteristic of all of them. Gnosis in terms of direct spiritual experience, but also the gnosis of seeing through what's happening all around us, looking under the hood, not being fooled by archons. So I want to spend some time on the better known ones in the space of this short video, and I have an exercise at the end. So let's talk about first the Sethians. In the Bible, after Cain kills Abel, Adam and Eve have another child, Seth. And for this group of Gnostics, Seth is a fabled first Gnostic. Hard to say, as I mentioned previously, how literally they took any of this. I think for a lot of them, these were wisdom stories rather than being held historically and literally. But in any case, Seth is held by them as a sort of forerunner of Jesus. So in the Sethian group, there are Christians and also non-Christians. And in fact, the scholar John Turner thinks that in Syria and a couple of other places, the Sethian Gnostics might actually go back to about 300 BC. So earlier than Christianity. They're the philosophical, or I should say more philosophical, more overtly philosophical, because all of Gnosticism is philosophical, but heavily influenced by Plato. In fact, some of their texts are called, like Allogenes, are called the Platonizing texts, because they lean on Plato so much. Some of them are very hard to read, they're very complex. The Sethians also call themselves the kingless generation. They're the people who stand apart. They mind their own way. And contrasting with the Sethians are the Valentinian Gnostics. Valentinus was their founder, and at one point, according to history, almost became a pope, an early pope. Can you imagine that fit? Probably better that he didn't. In any case, he's not the Valentine, as in Valentine's Day, but Valentinus, nevertheless, maybe this is a synchronicity, founded a school of Gnosticism that is heart-based. And so his schema is also very elaborate, but the ultimate God emanates 30 aeons that exist in pairs. So there's a lot of emphasis on pairs and couples and relationships in Valentinian Gnosticism. And their version of the end of the world looks like a giant party held just outside the Pleroma, just outside of heaven, where all the couples reunite. It reminds me of like a Mozart opera. They all get together, you know, after all the struggle and all the confusion, they finally find each other at the end. And then they go to heaven. So sounds pretty cool. Valentinians also put a lot of emphasis on ritual. Some of the Sethians do too. But let me say a little bit more about others. So there's the Ophite Gnostics. Ophite means serpent, and for them, the serpent in Eden was actually a good thing. Actually the instructor, and sometimes they pair the serpent with Jesus. And so the idea here is that we don't belong in Eden, mindlessly obeying God for the rest of our lives. So from a Gnostic point of view, that's what a lot of authoritarian religious people think they want, but we don't grow that way. So we got kicked out of the garden. And then the Paratics, the name means travel. And so like the Euians, and that's J-E-U, Euians, and also like the whoever was behind the Pistis Sophia, maybe the same group. They put a lot of emphasis on traveling beyond the cosmos and escaping, being liberated from the whole show. So that's some of what they were up to, travelers. As Gnostic Jesus often said, be passersby, although he was referring to dodging archons. So a couple others I want to mention. There were the Manichaeans, 3rd century, got to start in Persia under the prophet Mani, and they're often called Gnostic because they're very dualistic, and everything comes down to a war between good and evil. So heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, also from Persia. I'm not sure they are Gnostic, and the same about a later group. So now we're up in the 12th century, 13th century, the Cathars. So they were a Christian group in southern France who had major problems, ethical and otherwise, with how the church was being run at that time. So they emphasized things like the laying on of hands, ethical purity. They preached a lot about service and care. They were fond of the idea of a higher God and a lower God, and so the lower God had basically corrupted everything to do with religion, and they were trying to get beyond that. So they're often considered Gnostic. They were wiped out in the Albigensian Crusade that the church launched against them. So they went away. But those last two groups, the Manichaeans and the Cathars, they're what Gnosticism looks like when it expands beyond being a spiritual path for small groups of people and actually is a religion, which is why I'm continually unsure about whether they are Gnostic. I have a feeling that a Gnostic from the old times, an original Gnostic from 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century, might have looked at all that and said, this looks fairly hierarchical and archontic. So for me, that's an open question, but they're usually considered a form of Gnosticism. So let's have a little exercise. There's a Valentinian term I really like, cardionosis, and it means knowledge, gnosis, that's based in the heart. So one way of getting to that would be to, and try this out sometime, close your eyes and gradually move your awareness down from your head, which is where a lot of us Westerners tend to think most of our activity is, and move it down through your body until it's mostly in your heart. And then think of something that's happening, or a problem that you're facing, or something you're curious about. And with your awareness in your heart, just ask yourself, what does the wisdom of my heart say about this? So it pushes beyond the usual reductive idea that the heart is just a pump in the chest, and it treats it more as a center of being. So try that out and see what pops up.